Welcome back to my Natural History of the Pacific Northwest class. I'm your host, Abe. And this unit is going to focus on mountains. Mountains are an incredible feature of our land here in Western Washington. And here in the North Cascades, there is just an amazing amount of topographic relief. And with all that variation in elevation, we also have huge variations in climate and ecosystems. And we are going to explore several different montane zones, ranging from the Silver Fir zone, the mountain hemlock zone, and all the way up into the subalpine zone. But there's actually more diversity of habitats than just at the zone level, or more diversity of, I guess, life than just at the zone level, which is a really broad level. Of course, the mountain environment is just rich with microclimates. So a southern aspect has a very different climate than a northern aspect, and in the bottom of a valley is very different than at the top of a ridge line. And so we're going to be thinking a lot about that, diversity of microclimate and how that affects the life, the plants, the animals, how different abiotic factors like moisture and heat and wind and light and all these things that affect plants and animals, how those vary on the landscape. So I figured the best way to do this is to take you to as many of these different zones and micro climates as possible. So right now we're going to start out fairly low. We've already talked about lowland forest, but we are at the upper end of the western hemlock zone in a really special place. I think it's actually a research natural area managed by the National Forest Service. And we are in this beautiful old growth stand. Beside me here is a young western hemlock growing in the shade of this giant Douglas fir tree. Truly a colossal tree. And this is a really special place. It's actually fairly accessible. So if you're in my class, I'll post a note as to where you could find this. But I'm going to walk around and show you some other cool features of this forest. And we can see how we're right at the, I'll show you how you can tell that we're right at the upper end of this western hemlock zone. So let's start over in this direction. Everything about this old growth stand is giant. This is a nurse log of immense proportions, and you know, we can see that it is springing with new life. There's young red huckleberries and wood ferns, which we know already love growing on wood. And at the risk of reviewing some things that I already covered in the lowland forest unit, I just wanted to point out how these nurse logs are really important. There's a western hemlock here springing up out of the nurse log. But over here is a new tree species that we haven't seen yet. So let's take a look at this. We're starting to transition into the Silver Fir zone. And this is a silver fir tree. Silver firs are true firs, so like grand fir, which we saw in the lowland forest unit, they have some similar features. The bark isn't quite so blocky as the Douglas fir. These resin blisters are very common on most of the true firs, and especially silver fir. We can see actually that the wood has kind of a silverish hue. If you cut into the wood, like if you have lumber from a silver fir tree, it also is a little bit more of a silvery color. And you know, we are getting into the mountains, and what happens in the mountains? Well, the climate is colder and there's more snow. And so one adaptation that the silver firs and all the trees that grow even higher than the silver firs have is fairly short branches, because long branches break off easily under snow loading conditions. These short branches, they're actually even pointed down a little bit, and they shed snow really easily without breaking off limbs as much. Silver firs have good adaptations for cooler climates. They're shade tolerant, so they form a climax ecosystem. The silver fir zone is dominated by silver fir trees, and they can spring up under the shade of large silver fir trees. Here are the needles of the silver fir, and some features. Like most firs, they have really flat needles, so you can't roll them in your hand or roll them between your fingers. They're too flat to roll. They're pretty blunt on the tip. They have white lines of stomata just on the underside. And a feature that I clue into is the fact that on silver fir, near the middle of the twig, a lot of the needles angle and point towards the tip of the twig. So you can see those needles pointing towards the tip, whereas grand fir, they all just kind of point more at a right angle to the twig, to the sides laterally. One other thing about silver fir that's similar to all the other firs is that the cones, all the other true firs, is the cones are upright. And you don't usually find the cones laying on the ground because they disintegrate scale by scale, and the cones are only found way up on the top of the trees. So you just don't see them because the squirrels, they eat the cones quickly, and or they just fall apart scale by scale, and they're so high up that they're not laying everywhere on the ground like the Doug fir cones are under this massive old growth. So that's the silver fir, Abies amabilis, Pacific silver fir. The understory of the silver fir zone forests will often have oval leaf blueberry, and here's one. They look like the blueberries you might buy in the grocery store. They're in the same genus, Vaccinium, but the berries are often up on the top end of the stem, and they have a really short pedicel. And we have two species that look fairly similar, the Alaskan blueberry and the oval leaf blueberry. This is oval leaf, and a good way to tell them apart is the oval leaf stems are shorter and point upwards, whereas the Alaskan blueberry stems are longer and they tend to point straight out. Now, oval leaf also tastes a lot better, so if you're like me, you want to put your taste buds to the test, you could snack on one. Alaska blueberries are kind of bland, they don't have much flavor at all, whereas the oval leaf blueberry is sweeter. So this oval leaf blueberry replaces the red huckleberry as we move up in elevation, and we see this from about this elevation all the way up into the subalpine and occasionally up into the alpine meadows. But once we get into the alpine zone, it is replaced by yet more species of Vaccinium, and the shrubs actually become really important. The silver fir forest doesn't tend to experience big disturbances like the fires that disturb western hemlock zone forests. Here trees tend to just die of old age or root rot, or we get these single tree gaps that open up, and actually behind me is one of those big gaps because a couple trees maybe got root rot and died and tipped over, and now there's a lot of light hitting the understory and we get a lot of shrubs. Whereas in other directions, like back this way, over here underneath this giant Douglas fir tree, there's very little understory. So that's variation that is very typical in close proximity to each other within a silver fir forest. All right, that's basically what I want to cover in this zone, and now we're going to head even further up into the mountains and work our way into kind of the transition between the silver fir zone and the western hemlock zone. now I'm up at Heather Meadows, and we're still in the Silver Fir zone, but we're at the very top of the Silver Fir zone, and it's transitioning into a different forest zone, which I'm going to say more about in a second. But let's just go over here. We could see that the trees in general are more stunted. They don't get as tall. There's more openness between the trees. That has to do with kind of the subalpine tension zone. Here is a young Silver Fir tree. It actually could be quite old, but it's a lot smaller, and looks like a Christmas tree. Actually, it's a species that is used a lot as a Christmas tree. Okay, we're on the north side of the mountain here, and that means that it's generally a lot cooler than forests on the south side. The southern aspects get a lot more sunlight, and that dries out the soil and warms everything up more. And I don't know if the lens is going to reach far enough, but we could kind of see through the trees over in the distance to Church Mountain. And Church Mountain, the side that we see is facing south, and there the Silver Fir zone doesn't really start until you get up to about 3,000 feet, whereas here on the north-facing slope, it starts right around the Silver Fir campground down along the highway, which is, I think, around 1,200 feet or something. And so the Silver Fir zone on that side is a very narrow window, just between maybe 3,500 feet and maybe 4,000 feet or so. And then we have this long transition area where the trees just get thinner and thinner. And that's the subalpine kind of transition, the tension zone between a forested community and an alpine community. So as we move up, the climate is getting colder, and there are some other abiotic stresses that really start to influence plant life. So not only cold temperatures, which can freeze living cells, sometimes in some parts of the world it actually gets so cold that trees will explode on occasion. So cold temperatures are really stressful, especially to young trees, and they could limit the germination of tree seedlings. Snow depth can be really important, and that's probably what's limiting the tree growth here, is that, you know, Mount Baker ski area, known for the world record of snowfall in anywhere in the world. That's why it's a world record. And so snow is burying the seedlings for so long that they have a short growing season. Now, when you have steep snow, you also get shifting snow, and shifting snow can rip trees right out of the ground when avalanches happen. So that's another really important abiotic stress. And then we get just at higher elevations, there's less atmosphere, so plants have to deal with the ultraviolet radiation that is more intense the higher you get. And we don't see a lot of those adaptations here in the North Cascades, but you go to the Himalayas and a lot of plants are just covered with hairs because those hairs will block some of the ultraviolet radiation and also act a little bit like a greenhouse and warm up the plant during the extreme cold periods that are still sunny. So, natural history, we're always thinking about what kind of abiotic factors are limiting plants and animals, and how are they adapting to those conditions. And so as we move into the mountain hemlock zone, which is kind of a subalpine community that's often dominated by mountain hemlock, and at the higher end maybe subalpine fir, we're going to see trees that are basically reaching their upper limit because there's either too much shifting snow, there's too much snow, it's too cold, or in some cases, as you get on the very ridge tops, actually drought can be a problem too, because once the snow melts, there's no moisture at all because it doesn't really rain in the summer. So we see more of those kind of alpine communities further east in the Cascades than we do here in the western portion of the Cascades. But moisture stress can actually be a big deal in some alpine communities. Can you hear it? One of the best bird calls in the world. This is close relative of the Swainson's thrush, which we heard, I think, in our earlier unit, common in the lowlands. And the call sounds very similar. Kind of almost mechanical or two-toned, kind of like a Nintendo noise, maybe. Anyway, the hermit thrush is common in the mountains during the summers. They spend their summers up here. This is Picture Lake, one of the most iconic and photographed scenes in calendars and puzzles throughout North America. So we can see in the background is Mount Shuckson and Picture Lake in the foreground, and this is all part of the, the Picture Lake area is part of the subalpine community that's dominated mostly by mountain hemlocks. So I want to show you some features of the mountain hemlock. As you might imagine, the mountain hemlock is a close relative of the western hemlock, and it also has needles that are of varying lengths. But the mountain hemlock needles really splay out in all directions. They point up and down and to both sides, whereas the western hemlock needles tend to be unkempt looking, but not so sprawling in every single direction. So I think of the the mountain hemlock as looking like an electrified western hemlock. Somebody just stuck it into a light socket and the needles went, yeah! There are some good bark differences, and the cones are different as well. So let's go look at some bark. Mountain hemlock bark is a little more deeply furrowed than western hemlock bark. I think it looks a little more like Douglas fir bark almost, except the blocks, the furrows aren't typically quite as wide as they get on Douglas fir. And the cones are a lot longer than western hemlock. Mountain hemlock cones are usually at least an inch, sometimes up to 1.5 inches, whereas those of western hemlock are typically just half the size or less. Many people call this environment a subalpine parkland. It's very park-like in that we have big trees and we have meadow areas between the trees. Now in this elevation, the big trees are mostly the mountain hemlock, and we're going to explore a lot of the vegetation in those meadowy areas in between. It's actually a lot of shrubby plants in the huckleberry family. But what I want you to notice from a distance is how we have a big tree, and the big tree is often surrounded by a bunch of little trees. And these are what I like to call tree islands. So the big trees actually shed snow away from the bottom of the tree, and so there's this kind of like donut, like a tree well. If you're a skier, you've heard of this, an area where there isn't very much snowpack right around the base of the tree. Those snow wells melt out really early and extend the growing season for anything that can live right underneath the tree, like small trees. So we often will have clumps of trees all kind of huddled together, taking advantage of a common snow well where the growing season is actually longer once that snow actually melts. And speaking of snow melt, we can see off in the distance that snow is still melting. It is July 13th, and basically it's like spring to the community up here because the snow is just melting. So as we go up in elevation, the climate gets cooler and the growing season actually gets shorter. Not only does spring happen later, in this case in July, up on the top of that mountain, maybe late July, but it will start snowing here earlier too. Probably in September will be the first snows, and towards the end of September some snow that'll stick and accumulate. So lots of things going on that limit plant growth here, and so the things that are here have to be really hardy. So let's take a look at some of the shrub community. We reflected a bit on spring ephemerals down in the lowlands, but up here in the mountains we have ephemeral plants as well, and this here is called avalanche lily. See these big white petals, very pretty flower. Right now it is in peak bloom, so we could see that the anthers are coated with yellow pollen, and the stigma, one pistil sticking out of the center of the flower, and it has these stigmatic, 3 stigmatic surfaces at the top. But anyway, this plant flowers really early, just after the snow melts, and then disappears, and you would never know that it's there for the rest of the year. So right now the bees, I scared one off when I walked up to it. The bees are after that pollen, and they're also, the bumblebees especially really like the vacciniums, the huckleberries and blueberries. And this blueberry here is called Vaccinium deliciosum. It must be good. Or Cascade blueberry. And it has these flowers that are fairly spherical, or sometimes they're a little bit wider than they are long, as these ones are here. And they range in color from pink to this dark pink to kind of a light pink. Sometimes they're almost white. And the shrubs never really get much more than 2 feet tall, and they handle snowpack really well. They just lay flat when the snow's on top of them, and so we tend to see them in areas with a lot of snowpack. So as we move from the low Cascade blueberries towards the trees, we can see some taller shrubs, and I'm going to talk about those now. So one here, you can see the leaves are sort of bronzy colored. This will get to be a shrub. Here's one that's 3 or 4 feet tall. Hard to see back there. This is called big leaf huckleberry, or black huckleberry, because the fruit are black and the leaves are among the biggest leaves of any of the huckleberries that we have. So let me back up a bit and say that the huckleberries and the blueberries and even the cranberries are all actually in the same genus, Vaccinium. But if it's a Vaccinium that has a blueberry, we tend to call it a blueberry. If it's a Vaccinium that is tart and has a red berry, we call it a cranberry, especially if it grows in a bog. And if it is a Vaccinium that has a berry that's basically any other color, we tend to call it a huckleberry. So we have black huckleberries up in the mountains, and we have red huckleberries in the lowlands. And most people in Western Washington, when they hear the word huckleberry, they think of red huckleberry because it grows around our homes in the lowlands. But in many other parts of the West, like in Montana, most people, when they hear the word huckleberry, they think of the black huckleberry or the big leaf huckleberry. It has a lot of common names because it has a big distribution. So some features, the flowers are often this kind of bronzy pink. And if we take a close look at the leaves, this one is even a better example. They are not only big, but they're long, kind of pointed at the tip. They're an elliptical shape, so they look a little bit like a football. And the real good feature that I love is looking at the leaf margins. They are sharp, finely, but sharply serrated. Now these have a longer flowering season than most of the other plants in this area because they grow in the tree wells that melt out early. So this whole area, and maybe when we go up even higher, we'll see areas that are totally covered with snow, but right under the trees there's a patch without snow, and you have black huckleberries blooming. And the bumblebees are buzzing around me right now, and in the early spring they come out, and the queen bumblebees, they emerge quite early, and they fly from tree island to tree island just pollinating those, or collecting pollen and nectar from those black huckleberries. So they're a really important resource for some of our native pollinators, mainly the bumblebees up here, but later in the season the butterflies also do some pollinating too. A shrub that even gets a little bit taller is the Sitka mountain ash. Now this has red fruit that usually ripen probably in a month from now, and white flowers that haven't yet opened up because it's still early spring here. So here is a cluster that will burst the buds. The flower buds will burst open real soon, and we'll see these white flowers. A good feature for identifying the Sitka mountain ash from some other mountain ashes is that the leaflets are only serrated at the tip. the base of each leaflet is usually fairly smooth. But like all mountain ashes, they have leaves that are pinnately compound. So we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 leaflets on that one, and I think there's probably a range between a few more or a few less than that. Usually there's an odd number of leaflets because there's one on the tip. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. This one has 11 leaflets. I think that's more common. So these shrubs, all the shrubs in the mountains, either have to be strong enough to stick up through the snow, or they have to be flexible enough to lay down. So the Sitka mountain ash is one that is pretty flexible, and it'll just lay down and get buried by the snow. And one thing that helps it in situations where the snow might be shifting is that it doesn't have leaves, so in the winter, because the leaves fall off. And so it presents a little less surface area for the snow to grab when it's shifting. But a big avalanche would rip these out. This could only take a moderate amount of shifting snow before it would get ripped out. Here in this tall shrub area next to the tree island is a plant called white-flowered rhododendron. This is a native species of rhododendron that you really only find up higher in the mountains. And rhododendrons and vacciniums, the huckleberries and blueberries and the heathers, they're all in the heath family, or the Ericaceae. And this is a really hardy family. It does well in mountain environments. It also does well in bog environments. And I just want to point out a few traits about the Ericaceae. So they tend to have one of two types of flowers. All of the blueberries and huckleberries in the vaccinium genus have these urn-shaped flowers that they don't really have big petals. All the petals have been fused together into this urn shape. And actually the bumblebees, they grip onto that urn and they shake it by flexing their wing muscles really hard. They shake it and pollen falls out onto them. And that's how they get their pollen. It's called buzz pollination. And they're the only ones that can pollinate those urn-shaped flowers. Now, the other type of flower that we see in the Ericaceae is the flowers that have actual petals, like the rhododendrons. Now, rhododendron, our lowland rhododendron, the red flowered rhododendron, it has big flowers, but this white flowered rhododendron found in the mountains has flower petals that only spread out to be, the whole diameter of the flower is probably less than an inch. And when the rhododendrons, after they flower, they produce a seed capsule. So we have the false azalea or fool's huckleberry is in the rhododendron genus. It produces a capsule. Our white flowered rhododendron produces a capsule. We also have a bog rhododendron, Labrador tea is another rhododendron found here. So anyway, those all produce capsules. That's a good way to distinguish them from the huckleberries. Now, if we look closely at this leaf, we can see that it is covered with fine hairs. Now, later in the year, these hairs will actually disappear. So why would it have hairs in the spring but not later in the summer? Well, something that happens here in the spring is that you might get a freak snowstorm or a really cold spell of weather. And so the hairs, what they do is they slow down the wind that's moving across the leaf. And if you have a cold wind moving across the leaf, that could really suck moisture out of the leaf. And when you're just growing a new leaf, those leaves are tender. So, different plants have hairs for different reasons, but a lot of the mountain plants, they have hairs as a way of dealing with cold temperatures. They slow the wind down, and then there's not as much wind chill on the living tissue of the leaf, and not as much dehydration happens to the leaf, especially if the roots are still frozen in snow. Like some of these plants are, they'll start leafing out when there's still snow on the ground. So that's a good kind of natural history type thing to look for when you're looking at leaves in different communities, is to see Are there hairs on them? Do the hairs persist all year long? If they do persist all year long, then maybe that's more of a drought adaptation for summer conditions. But these actually fall off later in the spring and summer, and that tells me that they're probably a cold adaptation because the plant just doesn't need them later in the year. So we can range from the tree, which creates the tree island. Underneath the tree we have tall shrubs. These are the mountain ash. And then further out from the tall shrubs we have shorter shrubs, the Cascade blueberry. And the shrubs even get smaller. So here is a community of really short shrubs. These are heathers, and we have two species of heather here, the pink mountain heather and the white mountain heather. And they're not blooming here, but I'm going to find a spot where they're in bloom to say more about them. But I just want to drive home the point that in the mountains there is so much diversity of habitat because of all the different microclimates. So this is a range of microclimates that are created by snow. We see that sunlight creates a range of microclimates on a bigger scale, from one valley side, which might be shadier, to another valley side, which is sunnier. So those are just two factors that can create these microclimates. Disturbance is another one, and when we get up somewhere else, I'll show you a different type of meadow that isn't so much created by snowpack, but it's created by shifting snows. So we could have snowpack meadows and shifting snow meadows, and in those shifting snow meadows we tend to see more disturbance-loving plants, things that don't have above ground perennial tissues like all of these shrubs. Will have more herbaceous plants in those shifting snow meadows. So here are our most common heather species, the pink mountain heather and the white mountain heather. Higher up in the alpine zone we also will see the yellow mountain heather, especially on ridge lines. But these two heathers both have the urn-shaped flowers that are common in the Ericaceae, with the exception of the rhododendrons. And you know, the obvious difference is that one has a white flower and the other has a pink flower. Both of these species have evergreen leaves, and the leaves are needle-like. They almost look a little bit like conifer leaves. So they can handle having evergreen leaves because they're just buried by the snow, and so there's not a lot of cold stress on these leaves during the wintertime because the snow doesn't really get too much below freezing. The ground underneath the snow is a little bit warmer, and it's the real cold temperatures are up above the snow. So the trees that stick up above the snow, they have to have better adaptations for dealing with that extreme cold. But we can see that the leaves of the white mountain heather, it has these 4 ranks of very short needle-like leaves. I think it looks a lot like a cedar, whereas the leaves of the pink mountain heather, they look a little more like a fir. They're a little bit flatter, longer, and they stick out kind of from all different directions. So maybe they're a little more like a western hemlock in that respect. Yeah, so those are the 2 mountain heathers that are going to be on the study list, and both of them really thrive in these snowpack meadows. In fact, we call this area Heather Meadows because there's so much of that heather. There's actually a lot of Cascade blueberry too, and this is where I come every year to pick those darn blueberries, those tasty, delicious blueberries. Now I'm up at the Heather Meadows Visitor Center area, so up even higher, and we can see that it's almost winter time here, or just early spring. There's still snow most places. But we can see those tree islands are really popping out now, areas where the snow has melted out because there wasn't much snow underneath the trees to begin with. And also notice how the aspect really matters. So over here, this is the southern, this is a north-facing slope. So it gets a lot less sun every day, and it's almost completely covered with snow. And I think there's a lot more shifting snow here, and so we generally see fewer trees like over here. That's a scree slope. In another month it'll just be bare rocks. Lots of shifting snow, so much so that we don't really get any vegetation at all. The rocks are constantly rolling from avalanches. And then over on this side, this is a south-facing slope, and so it melts out earlier. Even though it's higher in elevation, the aspect has already melted most of the snow away. And there isn't as much shifting snow on that side. We could see that there's a lot of tree growth. So again, this all the different topography and relief and everything going on in the mountain creates all these different microhabitats and zones and opportunities for different plants and animals. Down there is Bagley Lake. It is covered with ice still for the most part. This year things are melting out a little later than last year, but in the last, I'd say since 2015 or 2014, we've had abnormally warm summers. And in fact, the summer of 2015, there used to be a permanent snowfield back there in the distance, but it melted completely in 2015 and hasn't come back since as a permanent snowfield. But I wonder if maybe this year it will, because we had a decent snowpack to begin with, and this spring has just been cloudier and cooler than some of our more recent springs. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the geology here because it's pretty interesting. We can see that a lot of the rocks down here are cracked in this kind of five-sided pentagon or hexagon, six-sided shape. Now, why is that? Well, this is actually a basalt rock. So it is formed by lava. And a long time ago, instead of Mount Baker being the dominant volcanic peak, there was a bigger mountain that is kind of over where we are here now. And it released giant lava flows, and that lava actually butted up against glaciers. So we had glacial ice, really, really cold conditions, and lava, super hot conditions at the same time, competing elements. And anyway, I think geologists have been able to determine that happened because we get smaller. These are called basalt or columnar basalt, and the hexagons or pentagons tend to be smaller when they cooled faster and bigger when they cooled more slowly. And so they can see where the interface was with the glacier because those basalt columns are much smaller in areas where it wasn't cooling against ice. Those basalt columns are bigger. But Table Mountain is all basalt in the distance here. It's called Table Mountain because much of it is very flat, and the highest point is also flat. And it is all basalt, and it was the center of this giant volcano, and the rest of the mountain is actually eroded away. So it used to be kind of a low point on the mountain, in the middle of the mountain. The rest blew up. It was the caldera, and all the rest of that mountain has eroded away, leaving what was magma in the center that cooled for Table Mountain. At least that's my understanding of it. I'm not a geologist, so I may have gotten a few of the details wrong. All right, we're going to head down towards Bagley Lake and see if we can find some more plants that are blooming, although, from the looks of it here, it's still pretty snowy down there. One benefit of being early is that you catch flowers that you might not normally see. And these are glacier lilies. They, like the avalanche lily, they spring out of the ground really early as soon as the snow melts. And I don't typically see them here because usually they're already gone by the time I come up here. So easy difference. These have giant yellow petals instead of giant white petals. They tend to have two basal leaves. They often have just one flower on the flowering stem, but here's one with two, and some of them might even have three petals on a flowering stem, but one or two is most common. This plant actually has an edible a lot of edibility. Traditionally, the Thompson in Canada, the Nkla'tnamux, as well as probably many other indigenous peoples, ate the corms down underneath this plant. And Mary Thomas, an elder that my supervisor worked with, she remembered eating them a lot as a child. But it's one of those foods that isn't eaten so much anymore. The flowers are also edible, as are the leaves and the stems, but evidently the corms, or that root, is the part that is mostly traditionally targeted for food. A great plant. I wish I can grow it in my own yard, but I think it's a little too warm down there for this one. This is a type of club moss here, and club mosses are not flowering plants. They reproduce by spores, so in that way they're similar to mosses, but unlike mosses, they actually have vascular tissue, so they can transport nutrients from their roots up a stem to the leaves. Whereas mosses, like this moss beside it here, they have to absorb all their water and nutrients directly through the leaf. They don't have any vascular tissue. So anyway, this one is called alpine club moss because it's common in the alpine areas, and it I think looks a little bit like a cedar or something like that, or kind of like that white mountain heather, except that it has these cones that are about maybe that long at the tips of the stems later in the year that will release spores and help the plant reproduce. Makes a nice ground cover in the mountain meadows. Okay, really cool plant on this rock slope here. This thing has these kind of slimy, sticky basal leaves. It's called butterwort, or Pinguicula vulgaris. And how does a plant go about getting enough nutrients growing right out of a rock like this? Well, this one has a secret strategy. It actually can trap insects. There's one on, ooh, I just rubbed it off, oops. I stole from it. It's a carnivorous plant, partially carnivorous plant. So the sticky leaves attract insects that stick, and then they slowly decompose and provide the plant with some nitrogen and other nutrients that it can't really get from the rock. And ordinarily rocks are probably too dry for plants, but this rock has a lot of these little cracks where water is seeping out of it, so there's actually a lot of the Pinguicula growing out of the cracks on the rock. So water from the cracks and nutrients from the sun a little bit, and also from insects that it traps and digests externally. Beside me here is what looks like a small plant now, but will become a very large plant. It can get to be 6 feet tall later in the year when it's flowering. This is called false green hellebore, Veratrum viridi. Viridi just means green. And it is a monocot. We can tell that even at this stage because it has parallel leaf veins. So the veins extend from the base all the way up to the tip. And this plant is very toxic, so don't eat it. But it is a really important medicinal plant to a lot of Coast Salish and Northwest Coast indigenous peoples. The root usually is targeted for medicine, and it's an emetic, which means it'll make you throw up. And emetics were and are potent traditional medicines and used a lot in the traditional pharmacopoeia. Not something that we use that much in our Western pharmacopoeia. But so I know one use is to get rid of worms. It doesn't only make you vomit, it'll also make you poop a lot, and it'll kill the worms inside your gut. So I've heard an account of somebody that ate this because they had intestinal parasites or worms, and it worked. But you have to be careful not to take too much or it'll kill you too. This has kind of greenish flowers. It looks a little bit like a corn plant when it's fully mature, and for that reason some people call it corn lily. But it's not that closely related to the lilies that we just saw, the avalanche lily and the glacier lily. Here we have Alaskan saxifrage. Now this plant loves growing on rocks, and it can handle dry conditions pretty well, and rocks are often dry, especially when they're on the south side of a slope like this, or south-facing slope like this. This plant has some good distinctive features. It has this basal rosette of leaves. Now a rosette means that all the leaves radiate around a central point that's on the root shoot interface. And we can see that the margins of that leaf are pretty sharply serrated or pointed, almost lobed. And then it has white flowers with 5 petals and a much branched stem that has a lot of those flowers on each branch without too many leaves. Just a few leaves here or there. So there's one, it's actually called a bract on that stem right below where the leaf comes out. But for the most part, not too many of those bracts, or the bracts stay pretty small. And let's see, the whole plant is covered with hairs. So I like seeing this because it reminds me of northern British Columbia and the mountains and Alaska, and it's just a hardy plant that you see on rocks. This kind of mat-forming plant is actually more common when you get up into alpine areas that are pretty dry, especially. But again, we're on the south-facing ridge, so could dry out a lot more in the summer. This is one called spreading phlox, or Phlox diffusa. And I remember as a kid seeing this plant in the book and thinking, oh, that's the most beautiful thing in the world. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s, I think, that I saw it for the first time, just because I couldn't get myself up into the mountains. But it's got these pinkish, they actually look a little more purple than they normally do. Flowers are often more pink colored, or even white actually for that matter. So they range between a white and a pink, with 5 petals. And linear leaves. I think the foliage maybe looks like a dwarf rosemary or something. Phlox diffusa, or spreading phlox. Good find. This botanizing on a slope is sometimes nice because you don't really have to bend down as much. The low plants are just right at head level, eye level. This is Sitka valerian, and it's not blooming yet. The flowers look like they're going to be purple, but those are just the buds, and they burst open into white flowers. And some distinctive features are these opposite leaves. They're pinnately compound, usually with 3 or 5 leaflets. And they get to be 2 feet tall maybe, and with a big clump of white flowers right at the top. Now, you've probably heard of valerian as a medicine. There's a European variety of valerian that medicine comes from. But I've heard that some people use the Sitka valerian with similar effects. This is alpine ladyfern. Looks very similar to the ladyfern that grows in the lowlands, but it likes growing in scree slopes, maybe slopes that don't have quite enough disturbance to be totally bare. But we could see, here's a big rock that fell down from above, and here we have the alpine ladyfern. So like the ladyfern, it has clumping rhizomes, and let's see, the widest point is kind of in the middle, tapers to a tip, has a few little hairy scales on the stem, and it'll get to be maybe this tall later in the summer, so it's still pretty early for this alpine ladyfern. This is partridge foot. It is a very small herbaceous plant in the rose family, and it has a white flower and forms these nice mats. And it does better in areas that have a little more of like landslide type disturbance, shifting snow areas. So we're starting to move a little bit into that community, away from the heather dominated community. But to be honest, I'm not sure that we're going to be able to see too many of those plants because most of them are still covered with snow. we're going to work our way up this trail a little bit further, but we might have to turn around and go lower to catch some of the plants that I usually cover in this module. Now we can have creeks and wetlands in the mountains just as we could have them in the lowlands. And here's a plant that likes growing right on the edge of these little rivulets and mountain creeks. This is called Ranunculus eschscholtzii. I can't remember the common name, maybe alpine buttercup or mountain buttercup or something like that. So it has a yellow flower and multiple pistils like most buttercups with a palmately compound leaf. Another species that likes growing in these rivulets is this white marsh marigold. So this is actually in the buttercup family, even though it has white petals instead of yellow petals. It has multiple pistils, which all the buttercups do. But this is a different genus than the Ranunculus genus, which all the ones that have the common name buttercup are in. This is in the genus Caltha. And the Calthas have a simple leaf that is not lobed. And it's kind of heart-shaped and has these wavy margins. But the big white petals on this are pretty unmistakable. And the habitat of growing next to the rivers is also pretty distinct. Another plant that's growing in here with these leathery leaves is actually called leather-leaved saxifrage. And it's not flowering right now, but these serrated margins on a thick leathery leaf, and there are a lot of these old flower heads laying around to give us a clue. These actually are a bright red color. So it's a type of saxifrage that doesn't have a fine leaf. This has a real substantial leaf, whereas many of the saxifrages have a little bit more delicate leaves. This is a pretty picturesque look at the Begley Lakes area. We could see, again, Mount Shuckson in the background. But the thing I want to point out here is that I could say with confidence that this is a glacial valley. There used to be a glacier in this valley. And how do I know that? Well, because the glacier valleys always are kind of U-shaped with these maybe steep upper walls, but they slope down to a gradually sloping lower slope, and then they're pretty flat on the bottom. And we could see that here. There's actually a lake in the bottom of this one, so the snow and ice on top of the lake make it look flatter than it actually is. But these valley walls gradually taper down to almost flat. All right, another mountain shrub right below me here. This is called Spirea densiflora, or wait for it, alpine spirea, subalpine spirea. Some features that distinguish this from the lowland Douglas spirea are these fairly domed or flat-topped flower clusters compared with the pyramid-shaped flower clusters of the Douglas spirea. Now these will be pink. These are last year's flowers, but we could see some pink flowers that are starting to emerge in places on this. This shrub stays small, never gets to be more than maybe 2 feet tall. And like the Douglas spirea, it has serrated leaf tips, but the leaves aren't nearly as long. They tend to be a little more round-shaped rather than oval-shaped. This is a real alpine plant. It's very low-growing, doesn't have any woody tissue. It dies back to a perennial root every year. This is called Sebaldia. It's in the rose family. It has these yellow flowers with radial symmetry, 5 petals, and leaves that are trifoliate. So in that way it looks a little bit like maybe a clover or something. But the leaves are not round on the tip. They are abruptly truncated to 3 teeth. So maybe they actually are a little more like a strawberry leaf. some of the strawberries are like that, but it doesn't produce a berry. It just has a dry seed. So Sebaldia procumbens is the Latin name, and we just call it Sebaldia as the common name. Here we have slide alder. This is a species that is found much more commonly up in the mountains, although it does show up on occasion lower down. Now, how can we tell this from the red alder that we see commonly in the lowlands? Well, the leaves of the slide alder are very sharply serrated. To me, they look a lot like a birch leaf. It has catkins, both, it's releasing pollen right now. It has both male and female catkins, like a red alder and other members of the birch family, the Betulaceae. But I think of these catkins as being a lot fatter than the other species I just mentioned. And in the mountains, at least, it never gets very tall. It is very flexible. It's just designed to lay down flat when it gets hit by an avalanche or shifting snow. And that's why it's called slide alder. This thing is a bear, though, to walk through if it grows in abundance. Bushwhacking through a bunch of slide alder is about the worst bushwhacking you could ever do. So avoid it at all costs. I would prefer to walk up a stream rather than through slide alder. I think that's all I want to say. Oh, one thing that I noticed in the spring is that the leaves will release this sweet smell that just fills the air on a warm day. Beautiful aroma. Well, that's all for our mountains unit. We looked at everything from the Silver Fir zone to the mountain hemlock zone and even some alpine zone plants. We thought about how aspect and moisture and disturbance all affect the mountain plant community. And I just want to close by discussing why I think the mountain environments are so special, especially the subalpine and alpine meadows. Trees really dominate most of our communities in Western Washington, but up here in the mountains we have these natural meadow communities where a lot of plants are flowering. So trees flower, but they have these wind-pollinated flowers, whereas the meadow plants, they flower with big flowers that are both pleasing to people like me, but also really important for animals like bumblebees and butterflies. And with climate change, these montane meadow communities are actually shrinking as the tree line moves up. So snow, remember, and shifting snow, and cold temperatures, these are all factors that keep trees below the tension zone, the subalpine tree line. But with climate change, we're getting less snowpack, and the snow is melting out earlier and falling later. So there's a longer growing season, and trees are kind of taking over some of these mountain meadows, and we're losing our well, I don't know that we're losing yet, but I feel like the butterflies and the bumblebee communities are potentially at risk as the trees march up the mountainside. So I just wanted to end with that closing thought on the mountain unit. And, you know, this is the last module of the class, so I also want to thank you for joining my natural history class, and I hope you enjoyed the videos. I know that in-person field trips are a lot more fun and enable you to do a lot more self-guided learning, which I think is really valuable. So I hope that you've been able to make it out to some of these sites to see the things that I discuss on video, and think a little harder about these communities while you're doing some of your natural history observation time. But regardless, I hope you see this class as kind of a beginning point in your understanding of the natural world, and you continue to ask hard questions about the things you see, because that's where more learning comes. And no matter what you decide to pursue in your professional career, I think natural history can really enrich your life. For me, it's really grounding. It helps me better understand the world around me. It gives me a sense of place, sense of belonging. You know, I return to the same places year to year and see how they change. Over time, those places take on meaning because they embody memories. And I think that's all part of a conservation ethic. So thanks again for joining me, and good luck with the rest of your academic careers. Take care.